This is Robert Landau, Live Life Well TV host, and this is another episode of a show here on Live Life Well TV that we call America's Greatest Personalities. This episode, we're going to take a look at the life and times of music, big band, jazz icon, the great Charlie Parker. Stay tuned. The great Charlie Parker once said, music is your own experience, your own thoughts, your wisdom. If you don't live it, it won't come out of your horn. They teach you there's a boundary line to music, but man, there's no boundary line to art. Charlie also once said this, and I love this: don't play the saxophone. Let it play you. And finally, Parker once said, you got to learn your instrument. Then you practice, practice, and practice. And then when you finally get up there on the bandstand, forget all of that and just wail. Every once in a while, somebody comes along who is nothing short of a musical genius. And how would you define a musical genius in this case? Somebody who is so good at what they do, it just flows naturally. But not flowing from up here, but flowing from here, the heart. That's where the artistry and passion happen to live in amazing souls like the great Charlie Parker. However, if you happen to have lived next or within the vicinity of the Parkers while he was growing up, all accounts point to it was interesting. Let's put it that way. So if you were one of his neighbors, you just might have said, and this is not documented, this is just me imagining, but you just might have said this: "Oh, Charlie, don't even ask me about the Parker family. All of us who lived next door or near the Parker family could hear was that damn instrument of his. And we could hear that damn instrument for at least 11 to 15 hours each and every day. You tried to live next door to that. And this wasn't the only type of noise that was going on for about a month, 2 months, or even a year. Oh no, the noise kept us awake for no less than 3 to 4 years. 11 to 15 hours each and every day for 3 to 4 years. You try living next door or near to that. Just be glad, if that was a true scenario, which it might have been, you weren't a neighbor of the Parkers. And all of that brouhaha started way back in Kansas City, Kansas, on August 29th, 1920, when Charles Parker Jr. was born. He was the only child of Charles and Addie Parker. Charles Sr. was hardly ever a part of Charles Jr.'s childhood. Charles Sr. was an alleged alcoholic and was seldom home to see his only child grow. Charles Sr. did have some talent, though. He happened to have been a pianist, a dancer, and if that wasn't enough, he was also a singer. Did any of that rub off on Charles Jr.? None of it did, at least at the time. And maybe some of that, if you think about it, just might have been psychological. In some cases, it is said that when the father is seldom there and the child needs for him to be there for obvious reasons, anger, rejection, and a whole lot of hurt can form in the psyche of, in this case, the son. So it very well could have been that young Charles turned off any connection he might have had with his dad, even a connection that might have influenced young Charlie during those very influenceable and moldable years. Charlie Jr. might have shut Charlie Sr. out just to protect his young self from further hurt, from further disappointment, and from further rejection. It was actually a young trombonist that ended up influencing young Charlie to take up the matter of being an artist, specifically a musician. Charlie was simply amazed at what this guy could do with the trombone. Improvisation, technique, and the sheer joy of playing swept over young Charlie like a huge wave. It wouldn't be until age 11 when Charlie would pick up the instrument that he would become famous for playing. Of course, the saxophone. He joined his school's band, and because he wasn't formally trained, legend has it that he would get kicked out of the band from time to time because he wasn't playing exactly up to par. Boy, was his heart in the right place, though. Charlie tightened up his act and began to play with various bands in the greater Kansas City area. In 1937, Parker joined Jay McShann's Territory Band. The band actually toured all over the States, and if that wasn't enough, that band would record as well. About this time, so early in his career, a very dark cloud would allegedly form over Charlie Parker. This wasn't by accident. Charlie invited, in many ways it is said, this dark cloud to hang over him, and once it did, he would never find a way to get out from under this cloud's cover, this cloud's reach, so to speak. As a teen, Charlie allegedly found himself addicted to morphine, which he had to take as a result of a very serious car accident. His morphine addiction allegedly eventually led to a serious heroin addiction. And it was this dark cloud of addiction that Charlie would wrestle with, it is said, for the rest of his life. Parker felt it was about time to take things to the next level at this time in his career. So to that end, he would get up and move to New York City. Now, think about it. He wasn't known there, so he had to support himself doing whatever he could. That included a $9 a week job as a dishwasher at Jimmy's Chicken Shack. In 1942, Charlie found himself playing with the great Earl Father Hines and his band, and there just happened to be a certain trumpet player in Earl Father Hines' band, a trumpet player whose name just about everybody knows who's into music, who's into jazz. Dizzy Gillespie. And here's what Charlie had to say about the very first time he met the legendary Dizzy Gillespie. And I quote, "Well, the first time, our official meeting, I might say, was on the bandstand of the Savoy Ballroom in New York City in 1939. McShann's band first came to New York. I'd been in New York previously, but I went back west and rejoined the band and came back to New York. Dizzy came by one night. I think it was the time he was working with Cab Calloway's band, and he sat in the band. I was quite fascinated with the fellow, and we became very good friends, and until this day we are. And that was the first time I ever had the pleasure to meet Dizzy Gillespie." Who would have known then that the collaborations between Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie would have such a major effect on the fine art of music that is called jazz? By this time, things already had gone from big band to jazz. But now a new type of jazz appeared on the scene, and Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie were the main ones responsible for this new hot sound. A sound that unfortunately wasn't fully embraced by the general public, as well as certain individuals within the mainstream jazz movement. And the name of this new type of jazz just happened to have been called bebop. And what a great new form of jazz this happened to have been. Now, Parker, Gillespie, and many others were playing in a number of bands in and out of Harlem. In 1945, Charlie made a recording that many still are talking about to this very day. What many are still also talking about to this very day is how, unfortunately, Charlie's alleged addiction would often get the best of him. An addiction to heroin can actually be a very, very serious and dangerous thing. Many feel it was just that for Charlie. He would often miss performing dates and would end up being fired from some others. Many a time Charlie would hit the streets just to get enough drug money. Things only allegedly worsened for him when his heroin dealer was arrested, making heroin even harder for Charlie to find. If Charlie couldn't get the heroin he needed to maintain his addiction, then drinking might fill the gap. Often drunk during recording sessions and the like, Charlie's career and newfound fame unfortunately started to falter. Not only that, but he would often show up to concert and recording dates without his saxophone. He would sell his instrument for drugs and would end up having to borrow one for the gig. By the way, he wasn't the only prize musician to have this type of alleged addiction issue. So many in his line of work were dealing with very much the same thing. Think of Billie Holiday. Think of many others. It was never an easy thing. It unfortunately seemed to come with the territory for so many at that particular point in time. But if you think about it, drinking and drugs have always been associated with the music of the day, and in many ways, it still is very much the case. Things would often get pretty bad for those who choose this difficult path. In July of 1951, Parker's New York cabaret license was revoked at the request of the narcotics squad. What this meant, unfortunately, was that Charlie Parker was banned from performing in New York City nightclubs. That, of course, was a major blow to Charlie. His license, fortunately, would be reinstated in 1953. During these times, Parker would often, unfortunately, be broke, in debt, and in very poor physical and mental health. He would even attempt suicide not once, but twice. In 1954, he voluntarily checked himself into Bellevue Hospital in New York. Not only that, but one night after a recording session, Charlie returned to his hotel and started drinking heavily. So much so that on 3 separate occasions, he was seen going down to the front desk totally naked, and each time asking to use the telephone. Each time the front desk allegedly refused, and the hotel manager eventually had to lock him in his hotel room. But unfortunately, things would only get worse. At some point during that evening, Charlie set fire to his mattress with a cigarette and then proceeded to run through the hotel lobby wearing only a pair of socks. He was promptly arrested and subsequently committed to Camarillo State Mental Hospital, where he stayed for no less than 6 months. As tragic a situation as Parker might have been in at the time, those 6 months were actually really good for him and his spirit. This would eventually translate itself into his career. In short, Charlie ended up feeling pretty clean and good, in high spirits, when he left that mental hospital at the end of his stay. He poured himself into his career like he never had before, and the results were nothing short of spectacular. And thank God for that. Parker would go on to help form a new type of music within the jazz realm of things. Charlie always loved classical music, so much so that he was willing to go to Europe to study the genre a bit more. And here is what he had to say about that. And I quote, "Well, seriously speaking, I'm going to try to go to Europe to study. I had the pleasure to meet a guy by the name of Edgar Varese in New York City. He's a classical composer from Europe. He's a Frenchman, very nice fellow, and he wants to teach me. In fact, he wants to write for me because he thinks I'm more or less on a serious basis, you know. And if he takes me over, after he's finished with me, I might have the chance to go to the Academy of Music out in Paris itself and study. My prime interest still is learning to play music, you know." Charlie was particularly interested in the music of classical composer Igor Stravinsky. To that end, Parker helped create a form of music called third stream music. The musical form combined the best of jazz and classical music. Charlie released an album unlike any other in his vast catalog of recordings. It was called, the album, Bird with Strings. Some of the tunes featured on that iconic album were April in Paris, Summertime, I Didn't Know What Time It Was, and If I Should Lose You. Many consider these tracks absolute masterpieces of form, musical composition, and improvisation. This recording was also Charlie's personal favorite. There is one other recording in Charlie's vast catalog that really is worth mentioning. In 1953, Charlie would give a concert in Toronto, Canada. This record, Jazz at Massey Hall, and that's Massey, is commonly known as the best jazz recording ever made. Think about that for a minute. That's incredible. And why not, actually? Not only did it feature Charlie Parker, but, get this, Dizzy Gillespie, Charles Mingus, Bud Powell, and Max Roach. True musical greats. Both of these records that I mentioned were made during a time of total clarity and commitment on Charlie's part, but unfortunately, that was not to last. Charlie's fame continued to soar through the 1950s until one day we would lose, rather abruptly, the incredible Charlie Parker. On March 12th, 1955, Charlie Parker lost his life while staying with a good friend. The official cause of death was pneumonia, as well as a bleeding ulcer, but make no mistake about it, this great man's death was also allegedly hastened by his many years of drug and alcohol abuse. So much so that, get this, allegedly, the coroner assigned to Charlie at the time mistakenly thought that Charlie Parker's body was that of a 50 or 60-year-old at best. At the time of Charlie's death, Charlie was only 34 years of age. He was survived by his wife, Chan Parker, and a stepdaughter, Kim Parker, who is a musician, as well as a son, Baird Parker. There are a couple of other things that you should know about the great Charlie Parker. Charlie Parker had a very famous nickname that you might know about. There were actually two. Bird was one of them, and Yardbird was the other. So how did he actually get this nickname Bird? And it's a darn good question, but one that has a couple of answers, actually. One answer to the question states that when Charlie was too young to go into clubs to hear the music, he would stay out in the yard and hear it from there, often playing his sax. A bird stays in a yard, so there you go, yard bird. But it's not that simple, because here's another idea. Parker himself once said that his little cousin could never pronounce Charlie and would often say Yarly. Gradually, he says that Yarl became Yard, Yardbird, and just simply Bird. And if that possibility isn't enough, how about this? One of Charlie's closest friends had this to say about the origin of Charlie's nickname, and I quote, "He told me he got the name Yardbird because he was crazy about eating chicken, fried, baked, boiled, stewed, anything. He loved it. Down there in the South, all chickens are called yardbirds. Every house has some," unquote. And if all of that wasn't enough, here is one more. The great Dizzy Gillespie once said, and I quote, "Charlie Parker's bluesy, syncopated style is often attributed to the influence of Old Yardbird, Buster Smith, a saxophonist out of Kansas City. I never heard Old Yardbird play, but I've heard a lot about him," unquote. So Dizzy is saying here that Charlie Parker inherited the nickname Yardbird from a previous saxophonist from Kansas City. It's a little confusing, don't you think? But it's no surprise that Charlie Bird Parker is universally loved not only as a superb musician, but as a wonderful and very dedicated and passionate human being as well. It is safe to say, as I've referred to him during this episode, that he is a true icon. So much so that none other than Clint Eastwood, I wonder if you know, made a film in honor of this great icon called Bird. That's the name of the film Clint Eastwood made in the 1980s honoring Charlie Parker. There's a nightclub named after him also. The great jazz group Manhattan Transfer sings a song dedicated to him. I mean, I could do a whole presentation on the numerous accolades that Charlie Bird Parker received during and after his life. So, in closing, what can I say that I actually haven't said already? True musical genius comes along every so often. In many cases, particularly nowadays, it's very rare. So what do when we don't have as many musical geniuses as we used to? Well, I guess that's a matter of opinion, but we look back at the lasting legacies of the true musical genius of icons in those genres of music that went before this time. Charlie Parker is certainly one of those. And his struggles, his ups, his downs, I believe that's a true part of what it is to be human. We all struggle throughout our journey. Some of us more intensely than others. When some of us fall, we tend to fall harder than others. With the same thing can be said as when we soar to great heights of happiness and joy. It's about passion. It's about the struggle to be here. That has never changed. So what do you make out of the 2 minutes that you're given? Well, those 2 minutes aren't always easy 2 minutes, but if you're an artist and you draw your art from here as opposed to here, that involves passion. And when you go through great pain, sometimes addictive energy, that gets channeled into your music, and people can feel and hear your struggles. People can feel and hear your heartbreak. People can hear your disappointment, your depression. Art reflects life, and art isn't always a happy, joyous thing. Sometimes art is full of pain and human disappointment and longing. Charlie Parker infused all of the great colors that he experienced on his journey into his music. What a wonderful gift for you and I, and for those after us to share. And that was the icon that was and will always be Charlie Parker. This has been Robert Landau, Live Life Well TV host. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you at another episode of America's Greatest Personalities.